Hi there everyone, welcome to the second video for week 8. In this video we're primarily going to discuss Leibniz's physics and so his theory of bodies. And specifically we're going to be looking at contrasting his theory of bodies with that of Descartes and Spinoza so that we can begin to, as I said in the last video, begin to unravel and understand Leibniz's very dense and complicated notion of what a substance is. And it is a natural question, given the progression of authors that we've discussed up to this point, is to ask the question, like what are bodies? What is the status of bodies relative to the ontology of other entities? And so I've written up here, our guiding question is, what are bodies, right? So what does it mean to describe an individual body in motion for all of the figures that we've discussed, right? Focusing especially on Descartes and Spinoza, mostly because they were very influential for the period. So our guiding question is, what is bodies? And so let's begin with a little review here. Recall that for Descartes, bodies are finite substances, right? And so they are not part of a single substance, right? They're relatively individuated from one another, right? This marker versus this marker, they occupy different places in space, right? And that's ultimately what makes them bodies that are different from each other. And so Descartes has this theory of finite substances, and then along with the theory of finite substances, he also then has a theory about, what we've been calling up to this point dualist interactionism, which is the belief that some modifications of bodies come from minds, right? So like whenever we decide I'm going to raise my hand, right, this physical body that is defined by a certain spatiotemporal location, right? I'm able to modify the spatiotemporal location through my mind, right? That's Descartes' account of free will. Now, by contrast, for Spinoza, bodies are modes conceived under the aspect is a little smushed there, of extension, right? So extension is an aspect of God. It's one of the two essential ways you can see and understand God. And individual bodies are modifications of a single substance. So we can see here, if bodies have a relative kind of independence for Descartes, but they don't really have this independence for Spinoza. Modes are only modes in virtue of being certain modifications of a single substance that's extended, and there's only one, that is God. And so we're going to see again that in Leibniz's rationalist theory, what he's always going to do basically is shoot for some space essentially between Descartes and Spinoza to try to give an account of bodies that is able to account for the rationalist insights of both of them. Okay, and so I'm going to be mostly drawing on I think they're the letters to Milanus, where he has the little dialogue format. You have a character explaining Malebranche's philosophical opinions. He was basically a Cartesian, and we could get into a lot more detail about him and what makes him different from other Cartesians and all that kind of stuff. But really, Leibniz just sort of uses him as a mouthpiece to kind of defend the general Cartesian picture. And then he introduces another character that sort of represents himself, of course, that's very, very smart and is going to point out a bunch of problems for this account. And what I want us to really understand is uh, why does Leibniz not say that bodies are a substance at all, right? What Leibniz says, and I've written it here, is that bodies are aggregates, right? An aggregate is like a heap or a pile of something. And the status of these aggregates are phenomenal. And so what that means, he's not saying that they're great, right? To say that they're phenomenal in this sense means that they only belong to the realm of appearances, not the way that things really are. And this is a very complicated idea. And so Descartes thought that bodies like this marker and this marker, he thought that they were real and that they were substantial in an important way, right? In Spinoza too, even if you took away from the individuality of each marker in a way by saying that they're both just modifications of God conceived under the attribute of extension, he at least is saying that, yes, there is something substantial about those bodies, right? These both are modes of God, right? And so they're kind of like real in an important sense. By contrast, Leibniz wants to say, Leibniz is an idealist. And the way that idealism is normally described is by saying that instead of saying the ordinary things that we see, desks and tables and markers and so on, are really out there as we see them, instead they are a projection in some way of our mind, right? And so here you can kind of see the comparison between the skeptical moment of Descartes, where you're like, is everything a dream, right? Leibniz, to some extent, is saying that our waking reality is very dreamlike. And what he means by that is precisely that things do not have the substantial, mind-independent reality that we often take them to have. And this signals a major difference between Leibniz, Descartes, and Spinoza. So to give you a little bit more of an idea of what his picture is before we get into why he thinks it and issues like this, Leibniz explains his idealism through a comparison to a rainbow, right? There was actually a really nice double rainbow in Albuquerque like a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if any of you saw that. But in any case, this is the central comparison that he's going to draw. He's going to be like, well, when you think about a rainbow, the rainbow's not really out there, right? It's not like in the Lucky Charms commercials you can like go to where the rainbow leads and there's a pot of gold or something like that. No. If you understand what a rainbow is, then you understand that it's an optical effect, right? It's not something that's really out there. It's a fact about how light hits your eyes, how light is reflected, and so on, right? And so what Leibniz is saying, in essence, is that we need to extend this metaphor that we would maybe say is okay for like optical illusions, right? And really extend it to our everyday perception of individual stuff, right? Markers and chairs and tables are just like this rainbow for Leibniz. And it's easy, I think, for some people to say, well, that is very absurd. You've kind of like just made all the like really material stuff like somehow dependent on our mind or something like that. And, I think that some people view this as very unattractive as a conclusion, right? But let's try to give it its due. Let's explain why is it that Leibniz really thought this? Why didn't he hold the more common sense view of somebody like Descartes, who would say, yes, there really are two markers here. They really are individual from one another, and they are extended substances, and so they're independent of any mind except for God's. Why doesn't Leibniz have this more common sense view? Well, really, there's two problems. I wrote up one here, but we should really write up the other one. Okay, so there's two interrelated problems with the Cartesian idea of extended substance. First problem. The first problem, we're going to actually begin with this one that I just wrote down, the adequacy of extension. And so you might recall from the previous week that to refer to the adequacy of a concept or idea is to say, do you comprehend the entire essence of that thing? And so in asking about the adequacy of extension, Leibniz is thinking, is it really true that bodies are just stuff that takes up space, right? We already saw Cavendish raise serious doubts about this view, right? Cavendish thought that motion was an essential, substantial feature of bodies, and so she disagreed with Descartes. Similarly, what Leibniz thinks that Descartes' account of bodies really leaves out is impenetrability, right? It's not enough that stuff takes up space, although that is, Leibniz says, an essential aspect of bodies. Another essential aspect of bodies is that they don't take up the same space, right? If they hit each other, they collide, they don't penetrate through one another, they are impenetrable, right? That is an essential aspect of what makes Descartes' account work. You might recall in Kevin's lecture, Kevin sort of pointed out that, as we're bodies and we're traveling through space, that we're just kind of bumping other objects on along the way. And so Leibniz says, well, if you want to take seriously that idea, you need more than just extension. It's not just enough that bodies take up space, but it's also that bodies are impenetrable with respect to one another. So in other words, only one body can take up that space. And if you think really deeply about this problem, you will then notice another problem. The other problem is what we might refer to as the problem of composition. Recall Descartes' definition of substance. So a substance is something that doesn't rely on anything else to exist, right? So in an absolute sense, God is the only substance because God's the only thing that doesn't rely on anything else for Descartes. Everything else relies on God's continuous creation of that thing. But then Descartes said, okay, but you can still give a definition of finite substances by saying that finite substances are the substances that depend only on God and not other finite substances. So the red of this red marker, that would be a mode, right? I could go through with this black one and cover over all the red, and then now there are at least two black colors, at least on the outside, right? You could imagine me replacing the inside too if you'd like. The point is that what Descartes' account allowed us to do is say, okay, this is a substance, it's independent of this one, right? And that's what authorizes me to call it a finite substance, is that it is a substance and it's not dependent on other substances. Right? Now the problem of composition is when you start thinking about the parts of bodies, right? What do I mean by this? Well, you know, in the Cartesian picture wants to say this marker is a finite substance because other than relying on God, it doesn't rely on anything else, right? It only relies on God and it takes up a certain amount of space. What about the atoms and all the stuff that compose it? Right? So like what if you go, you know, obviously at like an imaginative level, it's easy for us to be like, okay, this is one marker and this is two markers, and so on and so forth, right? You can have like a rough count, rough estimate. But Leibniz wants to think really metaphysically, right? So he wants to get down to the deepest possible level, not just something that's pragmatically useful to us, but the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So to understand it from a completely unqualified perspective. So not in the rough way that one, you know, flawed, imperfect human being could separate one thing from another, but, you know, we're after the kind of knowledge that, like, God would have, right? And so, if you think enough about what it means to be an extended substance, then you know, by definition, that all extended substances have parts, right? I mean, the easiest thing is to take the cap off, right? And here we have part one, which is the actual instrument, and then part two, which is the cap, right? But, you know, if you're a serious Cartesian, then you have to admit that in principle, this is infinitely divisible, right? So it's not just divisible into the cap and the, you know, what I've been just calling the body of the marker. You could then differentiate, okay, well, these little tiny marker specks are no longer on it, so they're not technically part of the marker, so on and so forth. And what Leibniz's point is that there's not even something exact like that, right? Every time that we imagine a body together, we always have an inexact imaginative outline of that thing, right? We never directly see all the things that compose it, and we never have like a direct, clear insight into the parts of it, right? And so, as a result, all of our imaginative knowledge, so like whenever we picture something, it's always inexact, right? Always inexact. And this is what Leibniz means by the rainbow metaphor. It's like the rainbow is an optical effect that our brain like reconstructs from the information that's given to it, right? And so it's not like there's something independently out there, the rainbow or something like that, that causes my perception of it. No, to the contrary, my brain is generating the perception of the rainbow. In the same way, you know, you might imagine a Leibnizian acquainted now with neuroscientific findings would say, hey, everything we know about neuroscience, what it tells us is that the brain is an extraordinarily complex organ and that it engaged in its perceptual operations, it is engaged in producing the images or representations that we have of stuff, right? And so we want to fall into this common attitude, like, why do I see a pen? Well, a pen is there, right? And that works in our everyday life, but if you think at a deep and metaphysical level, right, you're like, well, I don't have a totally distinct conception of what any of this stuff is, right? I don't know the exact, like, what exactly belongs to the rainbow and what doesn't belong to the rainbow, because that question's kind of nonsense, right? It's just an aggregate of stuff, and I impose a kind of order on it, right? Similarly, when I decide to see all of these masses and masses, enormous aggregates of atoms as markers in chairs and tables and so on, I'm choosing to take a certain perspective on them, right? And that's the essence of Leibniz's theory of bodies, is that, like, what there really are is just like a bunch of individual points or something like that. And then whenever we see stuff, we simplify it, right? We make a shape out of it. And so this simplification is the nature of our sensory perceptual experience. So thinking that way, bodies are phenomenal in the sense that how bodies appear is a product of our own minds, right? It's a product of how we decide to perceive the universe as given. And so this is why Leibniz affirms the mind dependence of all sensory perception. It all depends on how we end up perceiving things. Importantly, this doesn't just mean that it's all made up, right? It's not like everyone sees a rainbow in their own way, right? It's like, no, there's like actually mathematically explicable relationship between like how the light appears and like how it becomes manipulated by our brain, right? Remember the principle of sufficient reason. Even illusions have their reasons and their justifications. And so that's true of our visual sensory field, even if it is somewhat imaginative, right? Okay, this has gone on a little long, but I would like to speak at least a little bit about the Du Châtelet reading that you did. You read a selection from the Foundations of Physics. This was an incredibly important text. Emily Du Châtelet was herself an incredibly important philosopher, scientist, translator. She translated Newton's Principia Mathematica into French, and that was like the standard translation for like centuries, essentially. So she was very, very familiar with the natural science of her time. She was very, very familiar with the emerging natural scientific developments and figures like Newton. And so she's a very interesting figure because she wants to combine elements of Leibniz's metaphysics with aspects of Newton's physics and show that show that the physics given by Newton actually presuppose the metaphysics given by Leibniz. And she also credits Descartes and other figures as well. So just to speak briefly, consider again the principle of sufficient reason, right? So this is the principle that says that everything has a reason. And Du Châtelet argues that this is related to the notion of exactness in mathematics, right? So imagine that's me, and I'm throwing a rock, and it goes 5.6421 meters, right? Or whatever. That could be whoever you'd like if you're tired of me in the examples. So we have somebody, they throw something 5.6421 meters. What the principle of sufficient reason allows us to do is ask, why is it 5.6421 instead of 5.640? The point that I'm making is there's a reason it went exactly 5 meters. There's a reason it went exactly, 6/10ths of a meter, and 4/100ths of a meter, and 2/1000ths of a meter, and 1/10,000th of a meter, right? It's even though our ability to give exact and precise scientific explanations, like maybe we get like kind of worse and worse at it over time, right? Because we're finite creatures, our brain can only handle so much. If we could embody the perspective of God and see the universe how it really is, then we would see all of these numbers are fully determinate, and none of it is based on our psychological capabilities, right? And so the perspective embodied by physics is in some ways a perspective that assumes the principles of metaphysics. So in other words, I can do experiments, I can, create hypotheses as to why I went 5.6421 meters instead of 5.640, right? And I can test it, and I presume in my testing that there's a reason for why it went 5.6421 instead of 5.640 meters. So Du Châtelet says this metaphysical principle, the principle of sufficient reason, this is what lets the physicists go out into the world and assume that there's a mathematical explanation for everything. Similarly, the principle of the identity and indiscernible. So this follows from the principle of sufficient reason. So insofar as there's a reason for everything, there's always a reason for why two things are distinct. And the way that Leibniz normally explains this idea, and Du Châtelet also brings up this idea, is the idea of having two perfectly identical leaves, right? I can imagine two perfectly identical leaves, right? I can like go into a video editor, right, and copy and paste a leaf asset twice. That's possible, right? But what Leibniz is saying is that for everything that's actually out there in the world, we can always discover the reason for exactly why the way it is. So like why, you occupy this location instead of this location or something like that, right? And you can always discover the ground for that, right? So everything in the universe is fully determinate. All of it, at whatever level of scale you would like to imagine, all of it is fully determinate. None of it is TBD, right? All of it is set up. And then similarly, the principle or law of continuity says that forces have to act on objects that are immediately present to them. And here you can kind of see the Newtonian physical law that every force has an equal, or every action has an equal and opposite reaction, right? So like if I, punch or something like that, right, the force that I exert is then also blown back in an important way. It's not like in a movie or an anime or something like that where it's like you can punch and then it will like extend out however long until the person that you want to hit or something like that. The point is that physical forces operate by in a continuous line in the same way that we can have a number line, right? And so forces act in a continuous way. So yeah, that is some stuff about Leibniz, bodies, and physics. I hope that you all found this interesting because this is a topic that's, come up a few times this semester. I really love Emily du Châtelet's work, and I'm very interested to hear what you all have to say. And I hope you all have a great week. Remember, midterm. Remember midterm, 10:16 by midnight. Please contact me if you have any problems. Okay, bye.